A gunshot cracked through the night. Zahara froze, clutching her son. Shadows moved in the dark. Someone was hunting them, and they were close. Zahara Harper stood over the crooked wooden cross stabbed into the dry, cracked earth, her husband Thomas's grave. The wind howled across the prairie, tugging at her worn dress, but she barely felt it. Her hands gripped her son Caleb's small shoulders so tight that he let out a quiet whimper. She loosened her hold instantly, her fingers trembling as they brushed through his dusty blonde hair, matted with dirt from days without a proper wash. She wanted to say something, anything, to comfort him, but the words wouldn't come. They sat heavy in her throat, too big, too final. Thomas was gone, dead, buried beneath this lonely patch of land. And with him, every shred of hope and certainty she'd clung to had crumbled to dust. Behind her, the Grayson men stood like restless shadows. Victor, Thomas's older brother, spat a thick glob of spit into the dirt and tugged at the leather gun belt slung low on his hips. His boots scuffed the ground as he shifted, impatient. "Ain't no sense in standing here all day," he said, his voice rough and thick with indifference. "The dead don't care for long goodbyes. We got things to do." Zahara turned slowly, her eyes locking onto his cold blue stare. Anger flared in her chest, hot and sharp. "You act like he's already forgotten," she said, her voice raw from crying, from screaming into the silence when they'd lowered Thomas into the ground. "He was your brother." Victor scoffed, a harsh sound that grated against the quiet. "My brother made his choices, Zahara. Same as you did when you hitched yourself to him. But now he's in the dirt, and we've got to be practical. That's how it works out here." Practical. The word twisted in her gut like a knife. She glanced at the others standing nearby. Samuel, the youngest Grayson, barely more than a boy, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes darting to the ground like he wanted to sink into it. Their father, Henry Grayson, loomed behind them, a towering figure carved from stone, his face unreadable, his silence louder than any words. He hadn't spoken since the burial, hadn't even looked at her or Caleb. It was as if they didn't exist to him. Victor adjusted his hat, tipping it back to squint at the sky, the late afternoon sun sinking low and casting long, jagged shadows across the land. "We're leaving," he said flatly, nodding toward the horses tied to a splintered fence a few yards away. Their saddles creaked as they stamped the ground, restless to move. Zahara blinked, her mind sluggish with grief. "Leaving?" she repeated, her voice small. Caleb's little hands clutched her skirt tighter, his knuckles white against the faded fabric. Victor's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, we've got a long ride ahead, and we ain't waiting for you to dawdle." Her stomach turned to ice, a cold dread spreading through her veins. "You mean to leave us behind? Me and Caleb?" Samuel flinched, his head dipping lower, guilt flashing across his young face, but he said nothing. Victor exhaled sharply through his nose, like she was a child asking a stupid question. "Look, Zahara, you've got no claim to this homestead. My brother married you, sure, but this is Grayson land. Always has been, and it sure as hell doesn't belong to a woman, least of all one who can't pull her own weight." The meaning hit her like a punch. She was pregnant, 5 months along now, her belly rounding under her dress, her body slowing with every passing day. She couldn't work the fields like she used to, couldn't haul water or mend fences in the brutal heat. To them, she was useless, a burden. "I can still work," she argued, her voice trembling with desperation. "I can still help. I'm not helpless." Victor cut her off, his tone sharp. "Don't matter. A widow with a kid and another on the way? That's dead weight. We ain't got enough food, enough water, enough anything to go around. We're not carrying you." Caleb sensed the tension, his small body trembling as he pressed his face against her leg. Zahara's arm wrapped around him instinctively, shielding him from the harshness of Victor's words. "Thomas would never have allowed this," she whispered, more to herself than to them, clinging to the memory of her husband's kindness, his promises to keep them safe. Henry Grayson finally spoke, his voice low and grizzled, like rocks grinding together. "Thomas ain't here. The finality in his tone sent a fresh wave of fear crashing over her, but she squared her shoulders, refusing to let them see her break. "You can't just abandon us," she said, forcing steel into her voice. "Where will we go? How will we survive out here?" Victor smirked, a cruel twist of his lips. "That's your problem, not ours." Samuel hesitated, his voice barely above a mumble. "We left you some supplies in the shed." Victor shot him a glare, his eyes flashing with irritation, but Samuel stood his ground, his thin frame tense. It was a small mercy, maybe a sack of dried beans, a jug of water, but it wouldn't be enough. Not even close. Without another word, Victor turned on his heel, his boots kicking up dust as he strode to his horse and swung into the saddle. Henry followed, his movements slow and deliberate, not sparing her a single glance. Samuel lingered for a heartbeat, his eyes flickering with something like regret, before he mounted up and rode after them. Zahara stood frozen, watching as the three figures shrank into the distance, their horses kicking up clouds of dust along the dirt road. The sound of hooves faded, leaving only the whistle of the wind and the pounding of her own heart. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt the full weight of being alone, her and Caleb against a world that didn't care if they lived or died. A sharp gust swept across the prairie, cutting through the thin fabric of her dress and chilling her to the bone. Caleb sniffled, rubbing his red-rimmed eyes with grubby fists. "Mama, where do we go now?" he asked, his voice small and shaky. She swallowed the lump in her throat, dropping to one knee so she could look into his wide, frightened eyes. "We'll figure out," she said, forcing a small, shaky smile. "We always do, don't we?" But as she straightened up and looked around, the endless stretch of flat, unforgiving land, the tiny rotting shed that held their only possessions, the crude cross marking Thomas's grave, doubt clawed at her insides. Could they really make it? Did she even know where to start? By nightfall, the temperature had plummeted. The sky turned a deep, bruising purple, stars prickling through the darkness like cold, distant eyes. Zahara had managed to drag a meager pile of supplies from the shed. A small sack of dried meat, tough and salty, a water skin with barely a few gulps left, a frayed blanket, and an old rifle Thomas had kept tucked away, its barrel rusted from disuse. She built a weak fire with twigs and scraps of wood, the flames flickering pitifully against the vast night. Caleb curled against her side, his head resting on her lap, his breathing soft and uneven as he drifted into an uneasy sleep. She cradled the rifle across her knees, its weight unfamiliar but oddly comforting. The prairie came alive with sounds, distant howls of coyotes, the rustle of tall grass bending in the wind, the faint skitter of unseen creatures prowling the dark. Each noise sent her heart hammering, her fingers tightening around the rifle's cold metal. She wasn't naive. She knew they were vulnerable out here. A pregnant woman and a 5-year-old boy, alone with no walls, no protection. Predators didn't need to be human to find them. Wolves could smell weakness. So could men. Snap! A branch cracked in the distance. Zahara bolted upright, the rifle jerking to her shoulder, her breath catching in her chest. The fire's dim glow cast long, twisting shadows across the ground, but she couldn't see anything beyond its reach. The darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating. "Mama," Caleb stirred, rubbing his eyes, his voice sleepy and scared. "Shoo!" She hushed him, her gaze darting from shadow to shadow. The silence stretched on, heavy and tense, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire. Was it an animal, the wind, or something worse? Then, bang! A gunshot split the night, echoing through the trees not far off. Zahara's breath hitched. That was no hunter taking down game. It was too close, too deliberate. Her pulse roared in her ears. Caleb whimpered, clutching her arm. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice urgent as she scooped him into her arms. The rifle strap dug into her shoulder as she stumbled to her feet, her pregnant belly making every movement clumsy and slow. She didn't know where to run, only that staying meant death. The prairie was vast, and open, too open. Every step exposed her, the moonlight glinting off her pale dress like a beacon. Caleb clung to her, his small arms tight around her neck, his weight dragging her down. Her legs ached, her lungs burning as she pushed forward, the grass snagging at her skirts. Another gunshot rang out behind them, closer this time, followed by a low, chilling sound, laughter. Rough, cruel laughter that sent ice down her spine. Someone was out there. Someone was hunting them. Panic clawed at her throat, but she forced herself to keep moving. Her foot caught on a root, and she stumbled, nearly dropping Caleb. He cried out, and she hushed him quickly, her eyes scanning the dark. Then she heard it, hooves pounding the earth, growing louder with every second. Her blood ran cold. They were being chased. She didn't think. She ran, the uneven ground jarring her bones, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The sound of the rider closed in, relentless, until it stopped abruptly. Zahara whirled around, rifle raised, her arms shaking under its weight. A lone figure sat atop a horse just a few yards away, silhouetted against the moon. Broad shoulders, long dark hair tied back, a presence that felt both dangerous and deliberate. A Navajo warrior, his dark eyes locked onto hers, calm and unreadable, studying her like she was a puzzle he hadn't yet solved. "Stay back," she warned, her voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. He didn't move, didn't flinch, but something flickered in his gaze, recognition, maybe, or pity. Before she could decide what to do, the grass rustled behind her. She turned her head just enough to catch a glimpse of movement, a second shadow creeping closer, low and silent. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She wasn't alone with this warrior. She was surrounded. Trapped. "You run, you die," the warrior said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the chaos in her mind. It wasn't a threat, it was a fact, a warning. Caleb whimpered against her shoulder, his small body trembling. She had no idea if this man was an ally or another danger, but one thing was clear. Alone, they wouldn't survive the night. Her hands shook as she lowered the rifle, her eyes never leaving his. "What do you want?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He didn't answer, just watched her for a long moment. Then, with a slow nod, he slid off his horse, his movements fluid and silent, like he was part of the land itself. In one swift motion, he stepped forward, lifted her onto the horse behind the saddle, and hoisted Caleb up in front of her with an ease that startled her. She barely had time to grab the warrior's shoulders before the horse surged forward, its hooves muffled against the earth, carrying them into the unknown. The night swallowed them whole as they rode, the wind whipping past, stinging her face and tugging at her hair. Caleb pressed himself against her chest, his little hands clutching her dress, his breath warm against her neck. The warrior didn't speak, didn't turn, his focus fixed ahead as he guided the horse through the dark. The landscape blurred around them, twisted trees clawing at the sky, narrow ravines cutting through the earth, paths so hidden she'd never have found them on her own. She didn't know where they were going, didn't know who this man was or why he'd helped her. All she knew was the sound of distant shouts, men calling to each other, their voices faint but growing closer. Whoever was hunting her hadn't given up. Her mind raced. She'd spent years trusting Thomas, following his lead, believing he'd always protect them. Now he was gone, and she was in the hands of a stranger, a man who could turn on her at any moment. Could she trust him? Did she have a choice? The horse wove through the terrain with precision, the warrior's grip on the reins steady, his body tense but unshaken. Caleb shifted against her. "Mama, where are we going?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. The warrior answered without looking back. "Away." It wasn't much, barely an answer at all, but it was something. She clung to it, her arms tightening around Caleb as they rode deeper into the night. Hours passed, the skies softening from black to a deep indigo as dawn crept closer. The horse slowed, then stopped in a narrow canyon, its towering walls rising high on either side, the passage so tight the horse barely fit through. Zahara slid off the saddle, her legs wobbling as they hit the ground, her muscles screaming from the long ride. Caleb stayed close, his hand gripping hers. The warrior dismounted, his eyes scanning the horizon behind them before turning to her. "You can't stay here," he said simply, his voice low. Her exhausted mind struggled to catch up. "What do you mean?" He pointed back the way they'd come, his expression unreadable. "The men who followed won't stop. They know you're weak, that you have no one." The words cut deep, stripping away the fragile hope she'd been clinging to. She'd lost everything. Thomas, the homestead, the life she'd built. She was nothing now, just a woman on the run, a target for anyone who wanted to take what little she had left. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Then what do I do?" He stepped closer, pulling a water skin from his saddle and handing it to her. "Survive." She hesitated, then took it, the warm water sliding down her parched throat like a lifeline. She passed it to Caleb, who drank eagerly, his small hands shaking as he gripped the skin. The warrior watched them in silence, his dark eyes taking in every detail. Her trembling hands, the defiance in her stance, the fear she couldn't quite hide. Finally, he spoke again. "I am Kale." She wiped her mouth, her voice hoarse. "Zahara, this is my son, Caleb." He nodded, as if he'd already known, no surprise in his face. The sun peeked over the canyon's edge, casting golden light across the rocky walls. Zahara stared out at the land stretching before them. Vast, wild, unforgiving. Somewhere out there, Victor Grayson still breathed. Somewhere, those hunters still roamed, their laughter echoing in her memory. The danger was far from over. "Why are you helping us?" she asked, searching his face for answers. For the first time, his expression shifted, just a flicker, a crack in his calm mask. "Because once I didn't," he said, his voice heavy with something old, something buried. She didn't press him. She'd spent too long chasing explanations that never changed anything. "What now?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Cale exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "Now, you learn to fight." "Fight?" The word jolted her. She'd never held a gun until tonight, never imagined she'd need to. But she'd also never been left for dead, never been hunted like an animal. She thought of Victor's smirk, of the baby growing inside her, of Caleb's small, trusting hand in hers. Her jaw tightened. "Then teach me," she said, her voice firm. Cale nodded once, a quiet approval in his eyes. As the sun climbed higher, Zahara took her first step into a world she'd never been ready for. One where survival meant fighting, not begging. Days melted into one another in the canyon, each sunrise bringing new lessons. Cale was relentless, his patience endless, but his expectations high. He taught her how to track, reading bent grass and broken twigs like a story etched in the earth. He showed her how to move without sound, her steps light and careful, her breath controlled. And he taught her how to shoot. The rifle felt like a lead weight in her hands, its barrel cold and unforgiving. She stood in the canyon shadow, sweat beading on her forehead, her pregnant belly straining against her dress as she aimed at a wooden post Cale had hammered into the ground 50 yards away. Bang! The shot echoed off the walls, the bullet kicking up dirt a foot wide of the target. She cursed under her breath, frustration burning hot in her chest. "Again," Cale said, his voice calm but firm. She reset her stance, her arms aching, her fingers slick with sweat. Bang! Another miss. She lowered the rifle, her shoulders slumping. "I can't do this," she muttered. He stepped closer, his presence steadying her. "Your hands are too stiff. You're fighting the gun." She scowled, wiping her brow. "I'm holding a rifle, not baking bread." A faint twitch crossed his lips, almost a smile, gone before she could be sure. He adjusted her grip, his calloused fingers guiding hers. "Breathe with it. Let it move with you." She clenched her jaw, resisting the urge to snap back and tried again. Bang! This time, the bullet grazed the post, splintering the edge. Not perfect, but closer. Caleb, sitting nearby on a rock, clapped his hands, his face lighting up. "Mama hit it." he cheered, his voice cutting through the tension. Kale nodded. Better. She allowed herself a small breath of relief, a flicker of pride warming her chest. But before she could savor it, a sharp whistle pierced the air. Zahara turned, her body tensing as a figure appeared at the canyon's edge. Torin, a tall, broad-shouldered Navajo man she'd met days ago when Kale had first brought them to the encampment. His dark eyes burned with distrust, his mouth set in a hard line. He strode toward them, his steps deliberate, his gaze flicking to the rifle in her hands. "A white woman with a gun," he said, his voice low and edged with suspicion. "Should we be worried?" Kale didn't flinch. She learns to defend herself. Torin's stare shifted to Zahara, sharp as a blade. Defend against who? Us. Her pulse quickened, but she held his gaze. "I defend my son. Against anyone who'd hurt him." Torin studied her for a long, tense moment, then turned to Kale. "Elder Tuma wants to speak with you." Kale gave a single nod, and Torin lingered, his eyes lingering on Zahara with a warning before he turned and walked back toward the encampment. She exhaled slowly, her hand still tight on the rifle. "He doesn't trust me," she said, more to herself than to Kale. He didn't reply. His silence was answer enough. The Navajo encampment was tucked between towering cliffs, a hidden place of quiet strength. Huts made of wood and hide dotted the ground, smoke curling from small fires. Children darted between them, their laughter a soft balm against the weight in Zahara's chest. Kale led her, and Caleb through the village, the eyes of its people following her. Some curious, some cold, others unreadable. Elder Tuma sat outside his hut, an old man with deep lines carved into his face, his gray hair tied back, his gaze heavy with wisdom she couldn't hope to understand. Torin stood beside him, arms crossed, his presence a silent challenge. Kale stepped forward, speaking in their language, words Zahara couldn't grasp but felt in her bones. A conversation about her, about trust, about whether she belonged. Elder Tuma listened, his expression still, before his eyes settled on her. He spoke, his voice rough but steady. Kale translated. "He wants to know what you'll do when your enemies come for you." The question sent a shiver down her spine. She pictured Victor Grayson's smirk, the way he'd spat in the dirt and left her to die. He wouldn't let her escape so easily. Men like him didn't forgive survival. "I'll fight," she said, her voice clear despite the fear twisting inside her. Kale translated, and something flickered in Elder Tuma's eyes. Approval, maybe, or recognition. He nodded, speaking again. "You may stay," Kale said, "but you must prove your worth." Zahara nodded, understanding the weight of his words. Torin scoffed, a sharp sound of disbelief, but he held his tongue. She knew earning their trust wouldn't be easy, but this place, these people, had given her a chance she hadn't had alone. Days turned into weeks, each one a blur of labor and learning. Zahara threw herself into the work, helping the women weave baskets from tough grass, gathering herbs under their careful instruction, stirring pots of stew over open fires. Her hands blistered, her back ached, but it felt good to have purpose again. Caleb stayed close, shadowing her or playing with the other children, his laughter a rare brightness in her world. Torin watched her from a distance, his dark eyes narrowed, waiting for her to stumble, to prove she didn't belong. She didn't give him the satisfaction, but unease clung to her like a second skin. At night, when the village settled into quiet, she sat outside the small hut they'd given her, Caleb asleep beside her on a woven mat. The stars burned bright overhead, the air cool against her sweat-damp skin. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not by Torin, not by anyone she could see, but by something lurking just beyond the cliffs. Something waiting. Kale approached, his shadow stretching long in the firelight. "You don't sleep?" he observed, his voice quiet. She traced a pattern in the dirt with her fingertips, her nails caked with earth. "I can't. I feel it. Something's coming." He stood silent for a long moment, the weight of his presence steadying her. Then he said, "Because it is." The words sank into her like stones, cold and heavy. Before she could ask what he meant, the sound of hooves shattered the stillness. Distant at first, then closer, faster. A single rider burst from the darkness, galloping toward the village at full speed, shouting words she couldn't understand. Kale's face hardened, his hand tightening on the knife at his belt. He turned to her, his voice low and urgent. "They found you." Her heart stopped, then raced. She scrambled to her feet, rushing into the hut to grab Caleb, shaking him awake. "Mama," he mumbled, his eyes bleary with sleep. "We have to move," she said, pulling him into her arms. Outside, the village erupted into motion. Warriors snatching bows and rifles, women ushering children into huts, the air thick with tension. Zahara stepped into the firelight, the rifle clutched tight in her hands, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. Across the darkened plain, torches flared to life, their orange glow cutting through the night. Horses snorted, their riders' shadowy figures growing larger, closer. Victor Grayson rode at the front, his broad frame unmistakable, his men fanned out behind him. Their eyes glinted with something cruel and hungry, their torches casting flickering shadows across the ground. He reined his horse to a stop just beyond the village's edge, his head tilting as he took in the scene. A smirk curled his lips. "Well, look at this," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "Thought we left you for dead, Zahara. Seems you found yourself some new friends. But we both know you don't belong here." Rage boiled in her chest, hot and fierce. She stepped forward, Caleb behind her, her grip on the rifle steady despite the tremble in her legs. "You lost the right to say where I belong the day you abandoned us," she said, her voice cutting through the night. Victor's smirk faded, his hand dropping to the revolver at his hip. "Don't be foolish. I ain't here to argue. I'm here to take back what's mine." Her stomach twisted, confusion flashing through her. "What's yours?" His eyes slid past her to Caleb, huddled against her leg. The boy. Fear lashed through her, blinding and sharp. She moved in front of Caleb, shielding him with her body. "Over my dead body," she spat. Victor grinned, a predator's smile. "That can be arranged." Before the words fully left his mouth, a gunshot cracked the air. Zahara flinched, her heart leaping into her throat, but the bullet wasn't for her. One of Victor's men yelped, tumbling from his horse, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped through his fingers. Cale stood a few paces ahead, rifle still smoking, his eyes hard as flint. "You are not welcome here," he said, his voice low and steady. Victor's face twisted into a snarl. "This ain't your fight, savage." Cale didn't blink. "It is now." For a moment, the night held its breath, Victor's fingers twitching toward his gun, the Navajo warriors raising their bows, arrows poised to fly. Then Victor sneered. "Fine. You want to fight? We'll give you one." The world exploded into chaos. Gunfire split the air, torches hit the ground as Victor's men leapt from their saddles, charging forward with pistols and knives drawn. The warriors met them head-on, arrows slicing through the dark with deadly precision, war cries echoing off the cliffs. Zahara barely had time to react. A man lunged at her, his blade glinting in the firelight. She jerked the rifle up, catching the blow with the barrel. The impact jolted her arms, pain shooting through her shoulders as she staggered back. He sneered, shoving her hard, but she twisted, swinging the rifles but into his temple. He crumpled to the dirt, motionless. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her hands shaking. This wasn't target practice. This was raw, brutal survival. Another attacker charged, his eyes wild. She didn't hesitate this time. She raised a rifle and fired. The bullet slammed into his chest, and he stumbled back, shock freezing his face before he collapsed. Something cold settled over her, a realization that she'd taken a life, that this world had no room for mercy. She didn't have time to process it. A blur of movement caught her eye. Victor, stalking toward Caleb, a knife gleaming in his hand. "No!" she screamed, breaking into a desperate sprint. Victor yanked Caleb up by his arm, the boy's cry piercing the night. "Time to come home, boy," he growled. Zahara's vision tunneled. She fired, the bullet striking Victor's leg. He howled, dropping Caleb as he fell to his knees. She didn't stop. She lunged, slamming into him, sending them both sprawling into the dirt. He twisted beneath her, flipping her onto her back, his hands closing around her throat. "Should have died when I left you," he snarled, his face contorted with rage. Spots danced in her vision, her lungs burning as she clawed at his hands, his grip tightening. Then, suddenly, he jerked back, a sharp gasp escaping his lips. Cale stood behind him, a bloody knife in his hand. Victor's eyes widened, blood bubbling at his mouth as he slumped forward, lifeless. The fight ended as quickly as it began. Victor's remaining men, seeing their leader dead and the warriors still standing strong, turned and fled into the darkness, their horses thundering away. Silence fell, heavy and thick, broken only by the crackle of dying fires and the groans of the wounded. Zahara coughed, gasping for air as Caleb ran to her, burying his face in her chest, sobbing. She wrapped her arms around him, pressing her forehead to his. "It's over," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's over." Cale knelt beside her, offering his hand. She took it, letting him pull her to her feet. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, respect, a bond forged in blood and survival. She'd fought. She'd won. The night stretched on, the village tending its wounds, burying the dead. Victor Grayson was gone, his threats snuffed out, but the scars he'd left lingered. Weeks passed, the land breathing easier with each new day, the tension of that bloody night slowly fading into memory. Zahara stood on a ridge overlooking the valley below, her boots sinking slightly into the rocky soil. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the light catching the tips of the prairie grass swaying in the breeze. Below, near the Navajo encampment, Caleb played with the other children, his small figure weaving through them as they laughed and shouted. His voice drifted up to her, a bright, joyful sound that softened the ache in her chest. Her bruises had faded, her hands now rough with calluses from work and training, but the weight of everything, Thomas's death, Victor's betrayal, the fight, still lingered, a quiet shadow she carried with her. She watched Caleb for a moment longer, her eyes tracing his quick movements, the way he darted between the huts with a stick in hand, pretending it was a rifle. He was tougher now, his thin frame filling out, his spirit lighter than it had been in those dark days after they'd been abandoned. She flexed her fingers, feeling the stiffness from hours spent gripping the rifle Cale had taught her to use. The prairie stretched out before her, vast and wild, its beauty hiding dangers she'd come to know too well. She wasn't the same woman she'd been, helpless, grieving, lost. She'd changed, and the land had changed her. Footsteps approached, soft and steady against the uneven rock, a sound so faint it blended with the whisper of the wind. Zahara didn't turn. She knew it was Cale before he reached her, his presence as familiar now as the weight of the rifle she'd learned to carry. He stopped beside her, his tall frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the fading light, his dark hair tied back with a leather cord, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun's last rays clung to the earth. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, the silence between them comfortable, earned through nights of shared danger and days of hard-won trust. The valley below stretched out quiet and vast. The Navajo encampment nestled against the cliffs, its fires flickering like tiny stars against the growing dusk. "You have a choice," Cale said finally, his voice soft but firm, carrying the weight of everything they'd been through. The gunfire, the blood, the moment she'd chosen to fight instead of flee. She turned to him, her gaze tracing the lines of his face. The man who'd pulled her from the edge of death, who'd shown her how to stand when she'd thought she couldn't, how to aim when her hands shook. His dark eyes met hers, steady and unreadable, but there was something there, a quiet strength that anchored her. Beyond this valley, the world was cruel. Settlements with their hard eyes and harder rules, places that would see her as broken, a widow with nothing to her name, unfit for their neat little lives of order and judgment. She'd felt their stares before, the way they'd dismissed her as weak, a burden to be pitied or ignored. But here, among these people, she'd found something more, a chance to stand tall, to live on her own terms, to build something new from the ashes of the life Victor had tried to burn away. The prairie had tested her, stripped her bare, but it had also given her this, a place where her hands could work, where her voice could matter. She thought of Caleb, playing below, his laughter echoing up from the encampment, a sound that reminded her why she'd fought. Her chest tightened with a spark of strength, a fire she hadn't known she possessed until it was all she had left. She smiled, slow and sure, the corners of her mouth lifting as she looked at Cale. "I already made it," she said, her voice steady, ringing with a certainty forged in struggle. Cale tilted his head slightly, a faint flicker of approval passing through his dark eyes, the ghost of a nod acknowledging her words. The sun sank below the horizon, its last light bleeding away into the deep twilight blue of the sky, stars beginning to prick through the darkness. Zahara Harper stepped forward, her shoulders squared, her boots firm against the ridge. She wasn't the woman Victor had left to die, trembling beside Thomas's grave, nor Thomas's grieving widow, lost in a world that no longer fit her. She was someone reborn in fire and blood, shaped by the harsh lessons of the wild. The prairie lay open before her, endless and untamed, its grasses swaying softly in the evening breeze, hiding secrets and threats she'd learned to face. For the first time, she wasn't afraid. Not of the shadows that stretched long across the land, not of the unknown that waited beyond the cliffs. Whatever came next, danger lurking in the dark, hardship carved into the seasons, or a fragile hope she'd have to nurture, she'd meet it head-on, rifle in her hands, Caleb by her side. She was ready, not just to survive, but to claim her place in this unforgiving world.